This is Calocedrus decurrens. This is the first conifer for the next 2 weeks, or this week and next week. We're going to be doing exclusively conifers. And conifers differ a lot from the flowering plants that we've been talking about primarily in the beginning of the course. We, of course, looked at a deciduous conifer, Metasequoia, earlier on, but now exclusively we're going to be looking at evergreen conifers. Now, the evergreen conifers are ubiquitous in this part of the world, and they may not be ubiquitous in your part of the world, but conifers make up a fairly significant part of the natural flora on the west coast of North America. And a lot of the plants that we're going to be looking at are actually from this part of the world. Some are from elsewhere. Most conifers that we are going to look at belong to just a few families of plants, and once we get to know those families, it's pretty easy to kind of slot in the different plants into those genera. The Cupressaceae, this is a member of the Cupressaceae, the cypress family, is characterized by a couple of things. One is that it normally has very, very fibrous and vertically fissured bark. That's pretty typical. The cypress family also has a very, very interesting arrangement of its leaves, and that is that the leaves are mostly scale-like. That is very, very tiny and imbricate. Imbricate just means overlapping. The interesting thing to me about the cypress family is that the branching is primarily alternate, but the leaves are produced opposite each other. And the leaves are, in fact, and this is probably one of the most distinctive things about the Cupressaceae, is that the base of the leaf is decurrent along the stem. That means that it actually is stuck to the stem, and only the tip of the leaf spreads away from the branch. And so we'll show you a couple of pictures of that. Calocedrus, calo means beautiful, and cedrus means cedar. So this is the beautiful cedar. It's a very attractive conifer. And the specific epithet, decurrens, refers to those decurrent leaf bases. Now, that's not peculiar to Cupressaceae. It's found in a lot of conifer families as well. That decurrent leaf base is very common. The common name incense cedar derives from the fact that this is very, very aromatic. The foliage is very aromatic. Just walking down the street here, you'd be able to smell the incense cedar. And that's actually also a fairly common feature of conifers in general. They often have resinous smells, very, very strong, and those are the chemical compounds that make up those are typically very aromatic, turpentine-like smells. And the thought is that 250 million years ago, when conifers were starting to evolve, that these compounds were there because they're poisonous, and nobody wants to eat poisonous wood or leaves. So Calocedrus decurrens is native to basically to California and extreme southern Oregon in the mountains. And it grows high in the mountains in the snow belt. And Calocedrus has very, very flexible branches and a very narrow crown profile. And that is so that it can put up with heavy snow. And I'm talking, very, very deep, heavy snow. And that's when we see conifers that are narrow, and particularly conifers with very, very flexible branches, that's a good indicator that they grow in areas where there's lots of snow. This is Chamaecyparis piscifera Campylifera group. Chamaecyparis is a name that was coined by Linnaeus. Chami meaning dwarf and cypress meaning cypress. And so it makes sense when you look at a plant like this. But I think Linnaeus got it wrong. Most Chamaecyparis are actually fairly lofty trees, large in other words. And so we call them false cypress. Chamaecyparis are called false cypress typically. And this is known as the threadleaf false cypress. So Chamaecyparis piscifera, the species piscifera, we call Sawara cypress. That's a Japanese species. And it has this weird occasional mutation where rather than producing broad sprays of leaflets, it produces these stringy sprays of leaflets. And so we have this stringy look, hence the name threadleaf cypress. Now it's pretty easy to recognize because of this, and we can recognize that it's a Chamaecyparis because of the cones, and the cones are like little soccer balls. They're tiny, they're round, and they, if we can find an unopened cone, you can see that the cone scales are not arranged in an imbricate way, that is, they're not overlapping, but rather the edges of the cone scales come together in a manner that we call valvate, because they're pressed together rather than overlapping. So pressed together means valvate. So we have cones with valvate scales. That's very common in the Cupressaceae. It's almost all plants in the Cupressaceae, but not all. So it's very, very common. Again, like Thuya and like Calocedrus, we have imbricate scale-like leaves that are alternately arranged. The branches are alternately arranged, but the leaves themselves are oppositely arranged. And in fact, they are decussate, each pair at right angles to the next pair up the line. These smell like a combination of celery and black pepper. That's, to my nose, that's what I get. And that's a very distinctive smell. This is Juniperus sabina. We call this the Savin juniper, S-A-V-I-N, Savin juniper. And it's noted for its resilience. Most junipers don't do very well in the Vancouver area because they don't really want to have a lot of moisture around the roots in the winter. But Savin juniper does a reasonable job. The downside of Savin juniper is that it's incredibly aromatic, and it does have a little bit of a stinky smell. It's maybe stronger than a lot of people want. So aroma is often good in conifers, and sometimes it's a little bit overwhelming. So junipers as a rule can be shrubs or trees, and most of the junipers that we do grow are shrubby. And this is a kind of a wide spreading shrub, ultimately to about maybe 4 meters tall in the wild, but generally in the landscape nobody would ever let it get to that point. As I say, junipers are not very commonly grown anymore because of problems with disease in the winter, but Savin juniper still is a reasonably good ground cover in well-drained soil like it is here. Now I'm standing at the bottom of the slope, and so these plants are only about 1 meter tall. In terms of the leaf arrangement, typical of the Cupressaceae, we have alternate alternate branch arrangement, but and mostly oppositely arranged leaves, and these are very, very tiny scale-like leaves, so it's difficult to tell. But junipers are relatively easy to distinguish from other members of the cypress family because there is almost always juvenile, what we call juvenile foliage associated with the adult foliage. And that juvenile foliage, you see the needles rather than scales. That is, you have tiny needles that stick out from the branches, and they are not as strongly decurrent on the branch. So we'll get a close-up of that. Now, in terms of the reproductive structures, I did mention that most plants in the Cupraceae are monoecious, but junipers are dioecious. And so we have female clones and male clones. And if you have a female clone of a juniper, then it's going to produce the typical fruit of a juniper, which is like the chamaecyparis cone, but leathery rather than woody. And those valvate scale, cone scale edges are fused together. So it becomes like a berry rather than a cone. And it needs to be gnawed on by an animal to release the seeds, or if the seed rots, then the seed is exposed. So this Savin juniper could be a male or a female. This particular clone I know is a male that's never had any cones on it. And so you could call those juniper berries if you like, but technically they are cones. This is Picea omorica. Some people say omorica. This is known as the Serbian spruce, and this is a conifer that comes from the Balkans, that is the Eastern Mediterranean. Very, very small area that it comes from, the mountains. Again, like the Calicedras, a very, very narrow crown profile, which suggests very, very happy in snow, and very, very flexible branches too. So they bend right down quite easily. But this is a member of the pine family. The pine family is pretty easily recognized because in all cases, the leaves of plants in the pine family are discrete. That is, you can pull off a single needle all by itself. Now, pines produce their needles in little bundles, but they're still, once you pull off the little wrapper at the base, you can still find a single needle. So single needles and needle-like leaves, typically, these are fairly short, blue on the back. The blue is actually the result of two waxy bands that run down the length of the needle, green on top. And the great thing, the reason that Picea omorica is as ornamental as it is because the top side of the branch is green, but then as the tips flip up, you have these beautiful blue undersides. Now, this is a fairly tall tree, can probably grow to 30 meters or more. In the landscape locally, it's grown because it has a very, very narrow crown profile. That is not because we get snow, but because people want to have a conifer and they don't want to take up a lot of room. And so it works fairly well that way. Now, the pine family is well adapted to this climate that tolerates lots of winter moisture and summer drought. It's not perfect in summer drought. If we have an extended drought, then these things probably need a little bit of water. Now, in terms of reproduction, like plants in the Cupressaceae. The pine family is primarily monoecious, little tiny male cones, and then female cones, the seed cones, have imbricate scales. That is, they have overlapping scales, and they are spirally arranged scales. And everybody knows what a pine cone looks like. Well, a spruce cone looks a little bit like a pine cone, but typically is smoother and with more scales. And you have to, basically, you have to wait quite a while before the scales dry out enough to drop their seeds. So in terms of spruce, Picea in general are easily recognized because they have needles that are borne on tiny pegs. And this might not seem obvious when you're looking at a new branch, but when we look at an old branch where the needles have fallen off, then you can see all of the remnants of those pegs. All of the pegs become much more obvious. And that's, anybody who's ever tried to climb a spruce tree will know that. It's very, you get scraped all over the place from the old branches that are covered in pegs. Picea omorica is unusual among spruces in that it has blunt leaves, so they're not pointed, they're easy to handle, and they're flattened. Almost all spruce have needles that are four-sided. You can kind of roll them between your fingers. But Picea omorica is one of only 3 that I know of spruces with flattened needles. So this is our first pine. This is Pinus mugo. Mugo pine, common name mugo pine, or sometimes mountain pine. This is what we call a 2-needle pine. Now, pines are members of the pine family, and you remember that I said when we were talking about Picea, I said that all pine family plants have needles that are discrete. That is, they can be separated. And pines as a group come in sort of 3 flavors. They come in 2 needles, 3 needles, and 5 needles. And we're going to look at 2-needle pines primarily in this course, because the 2-needle pines are the most resilient and adaptable, and they're very, very tough plants. So they have needle-like leaves, and those needle-like leaves in this case are in pairs. That is, they're 2-needle pines. So I have a pair of leaves, and they have a little wrapper at the base, and when you look at the branch, you can see that there are bundles of needles all the way up the stems. And so every year we get, on this plant, it looks like we're getting something in the neighborhood of 10 to 20 centimeters of growth. And each year you have a complement of needles. And so in my hand I have 3 years worth of needles. And this is important because when you have a conifer that holds its needles, then the branches are going to be well clothed. And this is why mugo pine is used in the landscape. It's because it's a nice bushy plant. What people don't get with mugo pine, though, is that after 10 or 15 years, every 20 centimeters of growth is going to be on every branch of the plant, and all of a sudden it's going to become a huge shrub, and eventually it's going to become a tree with no needles at the base. And this is not what people usually want in a shrub. Now, on this branch that I have, they're the remnants of the male cones that were produced last year and dropped their pollen early this spring. And at the tip, there's a bud that's going to be next year's growth increment. And on some of these branches, I can see the developing female cones. Now those female cones were pollinated this year and are going to expand and become cones like this next year. And the pine cone is a very, very interesting structure. It is a woody structure, and it has imbricate scales. And those imbricate scales are not like they are in a spruce, but rather they have a kind of diamond-shaped pattern that's raised. And so pine cones, as a rule, are easily differentiated from other cones, plants in the pine family. This is Sequoia sempervirens. Sequoia is a genus in the Cupressaceae. It is it basically has the record for the tallest living trees on the planet. Over what is it? Over 110 meters, or I think over 120 meters. Anyway, very, very large trees, very tall trees, native to California, mostly coastal California, from about the San Francisco Bay north into southern Oregon. And these are trees that are they're coastal trees. They're tolerant of salt spray coming off the ocean, and because they're on the west coast of North America, where we typically have a summer drought, and we can have a very extended summer drought in California, upwards of 6 or 7 months without rain. These things survive on fog, and that fog rolls in, and the needles have the ability to actually absorb moisture that way. Now, in this part of the world, we don't have fog in the summertime, and so trees like this require deep soil where there's abundant moisture available in the summer. And so in an unirrigated landscape, these have some difficulty with establishment. But once they're established, they seem to find enough moisture even in our summer drought. But as I say, establishing it is difficult, particularly on a dry site. Now, this is a fairly easy plant to recognize. It looks a little bit like a U in the way that the needles are decurrent along the stems. They're needle-like. They're pointed, but they're not sharply pointed. But the way to tell Sequoia from Taxus is that Sequoia, the needles are strictly disticus. That is, they look like feathers. So an individual branchlet looks like a feather. You can see the buds. There are buds on the tips of the branches, and these are the male cones that will drop their pollen in the spring. Now, one of the things that I didn't mention about Cupressaceae before was that when the needles start to break down, they don't fall off individually, they fall off as a group. So the whole branchlet falls. And so this is true of Chamaecyparis and Thuya and Calocedrus and Sequoia, and it's going to be the same with the next plant we look at, which is Sequoia dendron. And this has a fancy name. It's called cladoptosis, which means falling off of a branch. And it is, if you look at the base of the tree, you will find not individual needles, but individual branchlets. The cones themselves, you would imagine with a tree that's over 300 feet, over 350 feet tall, that you'd have some massive cones, but in fact they're very small, and I'll find a couple of cones. They're very, very interesting cones. They have valvate scales like you would expect with Cupress AC. This is Sequoiadendron giganteum. Both sequoia and sequoiadendron are known as redwoods. We call the Sequoia sempervirens, we call that the coastal redwood or the coast redwood, and we call Sequoiadendron giganteum, we call this the big tree or the Sierra redwood. It has different names from around the world. In England, they call it Wellingtonia to celebrate Wellington, one of their national heroes. This is pretty typical of what it looks like in the wild. It's got kind of blue-green leaves. The leaves are scale-like but pointed, and they're spirally arranged around the branches. And they look a little bit like a juniper for that reason, but clearly a gigantic tree. Specimens in the wild known to grow to 100 meters. And this is a massive tree, whereas Sequoia sempervirens is a tall tree. Sequoiadendron giganteum is a massive tree. It really has a gigantic trunk, and I think it's known as the most massive single organism on the planet. It has cones, female cones, seed cones, that are larger than those of Sequoia sempervirens, about double the size, but they're very, very similar in their form, and you can have a look at that. In terms of cultivation, this is the easier tree to cultivate. It is essentially will grow in any environment other than shade and poorly drained soil. So it'll grow in any garden that I can think of in the Vancouver area. And it is, as I said, is a very, very large tree. It often, in shallow soil, it often develops what we call a buttressed base. So rather than the stem hitting the ground at a sort of sharp angle, it widens out and becomes more fluted at the base, and this plays havoc with, of course, with sidewalks and anything else that's nearby. So this is a tree that deserves to be on its own or in a group like it is here. This is actually very convenient. We have both Sequoia and Sequoiadendron in the same planting. We're looking at two Taxus today. Taxus is a genus in the Taxaceae. Taxus typically are shrubby trees, only tree-like after many, many years. And most of the Taxus that we grow in Vancouver, we grow as shrubs rather than trees, so they're typically pruned. This is Taxus baccata, cultivar called repandans. The Taxus baccata is the English yew, and repandans is, I believe, a male form. Taxus are dioecious plants, and Taxus baccata repandans, as you can see, is noted for its horizontal growth. It has kind of arching branches that layer. So gradually, without pruning, this is going to work its way up to 1.5 meters or so after maybe 20 years. But it's fairly easily kept low, and it's used as it's used here in front of La Serre. It's used as a kind of a tall evergreen ground cover. So Taxaceae and Taxus in particular produce their needle-like leaves in a spiral arrangement, but then, and so we would call that an alternate arrangement. It's spiral except that they sort of twist at their leaf bases to become more or less disticus, that is in two ranks, but it's pretty rough. It's not really very strongly two ranked. The needles themselves are relatively broad and long. We call this a linear leaf, and there are a couple of waxy stripes on the back of the leaf, so the lighter side on the back and the darker side above. Like many conifers, the leaves, this is kind of, it's not universal in conifers, but it's very, very common in conifers of all families. The leaves on Taxus are decurrent. That is, the leaf base is essentially attached to the stem, and so the leaf, anatomically, the leaf is much longer than just the leaf, the part of the leaf that sticks out. And so we'll get a close-up of that so that you can see it. The other thing that you can see is that you can see the male cones developing along the upper ends of the branches. As I said, this is a male form. The female Taxus produces a seed surrounded by a red aril, A-R-I-L, and an aril is just what we call an accessory structure that is good for attracting animals to disperse that fruit. All parts of Taxus are poisonous, all parts, except for that red aril, which you could eat, but if you don't spit out the seeds, you're going to be poisoned. And this is Taxus media. This is a cultivar, the most common of the hybrid yews, Taxus media. The most common is Hicksii. This is Hicks yew, and Hicks yew is a female. I think you can see there's an aril there, a few arils here and there. So that tells you that it's a female plant. Hicks yew is grown because it's incredibly vigorous, and yews in general are used as yews, Y-E-W-S, are used, U-S-E-D, in general because they are they're excellent hedging plants. You can prune them hard and they respond well. You can prune right into old wood, that is, wood that's this even this big around, and it resprouts. If you try that in the Cupressaceae or the Pinaceae, you end up with dead stems. And so this is a very, very useful plant. Now, it's not as fast growing as any Thuya or Calicedrus or Chamaecyparis, but it's fast enough that it will form a good hedge in a matter of a few years. Because it's slower, it's more expensive, and we do have some problems in people being able to afford a good yew hedge, and that's why we see much more Cupressaceae hedges. Again, like Taxus baccata, all parts of this plant are poisonous, and the advantage here, though, is we have upright strength, and this is going to grow to 15 meters if we let it. So this is Thuya occidentalis. This is a cultivar called Smaragd. Smaragd is a Danish word, and it means emerald. And so this is known as the emerald cedar or the emerald arborvitae. In eastern North America, primarily, Thuja occidentalis, which is the eastern white cedar, is known as arborvitae. In the West, most people don't use that term arborvitae, but you do see it occasionally. And so smaragd cedar, emerald cedar, smaragd arborvitae, emerald arborvitae, all of those names are common somewhere. In the Vancouver area, most people just call it emerald cedar. And you can see that it's a very, very fine textured plant. It's not unlike Calicedrus decurrens in the sort of overall arrangement of the leaves, but the scale leaves are much, much smaller in Thuja occidentalis. Now the genus Thuja is differentiated from other genera in Cupressaceae by the cones. The cones are a little bit like those of Calicedrus, but they have more scales. And so there are a few things that you can recognize about Thuja. One is these very, very flattened sprays of foliage. The branchlets are very, very flat, and the leaf size is tiny. Smaragd is known not just for its fine texture, but also for its narrow conical form. And what that means is that you don't have to prune it. And pruning is a big deal. I mean, in terms of maintenance, it's a big deal. So if you have good fertile soil that's moist in the summer, and it must be moist in the summer, then you can grow nice tall smaragds like this. If you don't have enough moisture in the summer, then smaragd cedars die. And this is something that we see all over Vancouver. We see new expensive hedges made from this. Everybody thinks this is great. And the first hot summer we get, they're dead because they really, really do need that extra water in the summer. This is aromatic. The Thujas are aromatic, but they're not as aromatic as Calicedrus. It is probably the most commonly planted hedging plant in Vancouver.